The Cold War was a dangerous game where two superpowers held the fate of humanity in their hands. Thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other across the Iron Curtain. At multiple moments, the world came terrifyingly close to nuclear annihilation. Yet somehow, against all odds, catastrophe was prevented. These are the stories of how humanity pulled back from the brink. They reveal the moments when miscalculation, accident, or misunderstanding nearly triggered World War III. They expose the systems that failed and the decisions that saved us. Most importantly, they show how luck, human judgment, and clear thinking prevented nuclear Armageddon. If you're intrigued by Cold War history and the thin margins between survival and extinction, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Now, let's explore the crises that nearly ended civilization. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days from Doomsday, 1962. In October 1962, the world held its breath. For 13 days, humanity stood on the precipice of nuclear war. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, the moment when Cold War tensions transformed into an existential threat to human civilization. The roots traced back to April 1961, when American-backed Cuban exiles attempted the Bay of Pigs invasion to overthrow Fidel Castro. The invasion failed catastrophically, embarrassing President Kennedy and strengthening Castro's alliance with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Sensing vulnerability, Khrushchev authorized the secret deployment of nuclear missiles to Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Richard Hazer made a high-altitude pass over Cuba and captured photographic evidence that changed everything. Soviet technicians were constructing launch facilities for SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles. The missiles were being assembled for installation. Kennedy was immediately briefed, and he assembled a secret group of advisors known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. The discovery shocked American leadership. A Soviet medium-range missile could reach Washington, D.C., New York, and every major American city. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously recommended bombing Cuba immediately. Kennedy's military advisors insisted on swift military action. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara later recalled, "I thought it was the last Saturday I would ever see." But Kennedy made a calculated decision. Instead of immediate military strikes, he ordered a naval blockade around Cuba, which he euphemistically called a quarantine. On October 22nd, Kennedy appeared on national television and revealed the crisis to the American people. Soviet ships carrying military supplies were approaching the blockade. The world watched, terrified. Soviet submarines were en route to Cuba. In the Atlantic Ocean, American destroyers tracked Soviet vessels. If a single ship attempted to run the blockade, the confrontation could spiral into armed conflict. Under the pressure of Cold War doctrine, either superpower's military miscalculation could trigger nuclear exchange. The tension peaked on October 27th, Black Saturday. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. Simultaneously, an erroneous radar reading falsely indicated a Soviet attack on Alaska. American nuclear bombers loaded with hydrogen bombs were ordered into the air, standing ready for launch. The Strategic Air Command reached DEFCON 2, just one step away from nuclear war. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in desperate back-channel communications. Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. Through these secret negotiations, a solution emerged. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The United States would secretly agree to remove American missiles from Turkey at a later date. On October 28th, Moscow radio announced Khrushchev's decision. In order to eliminate as rapidly as possible the conflict which endangers the cause of peace, the Soviet government has given a new order to dismantle the arms which you have described as offensive and to crate and return them to the Soviet Union. The crisis was over. Nuclear holocaust had been averted, but both superpowers were profoundly shaken. They realized how close they had come to annihilation. In response, they installed a direct hotline of teletype machines between Moscow and Washington, D.C. to prevent miscommunication during future crises. They also negotiated a partial nuclear test ban treaty that took effect in 1963. Berlin Wall crisis. Tank face-off at Checkpoint Charlie, 1961 to 1962. Before Cuba, another crisis brought superpowers to the brink. The Berlin crisis had festered since 1958, when Soviet Premier Khrushchev demanded the Western powers withdraw from West Berlin within 6 months. Berlin was unique. It sat deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but the Western powers, America, Britain, and France, maintained occupation zones in the city. By 1961, the Berlin crisis was escalating dangerously. Nearly 200,000 East Germans were fleeing to West Berlin annually, seeking freedom and prosperity. Khrushchev faced a demographic catastrophe. His communist state was literally depopulating itself. In June 1961, Kennedy and Khrushchev met in Vienna. The meeting ended acrimoniously. Khrushchev repeated his ultimatum. The West had 6 months to withdraw from Berlin. Kennedy responded grimly, "It's going to be a cold winter." On August 12 to 13, 1961, Khrushchev struck. East German troops, under Soviet command, began erecting barbed wire barriers across Berlin. By morning, a concrete wall divided the city. The Berlin Wall was constructed overnight, severing families and becoming the most iconic symbol of Cold War division. Yet the crisis continued. In October 1961, an American diplomat named Alan Leitner attempted to cross from West Berlin into East Berlin. East German police demanded he show his passport. Leitner refused, arguing that as a diplomat, he had the right to transit between sectors. East German authorities barred him from crossing. Kennedy was infuriated. He authorized tanks to roll toward Checkpoint Charlie. American tanks advanced to the border, their guns pointed directly at East German territory. Soviet tanks, in response, rolled forward from the east. They faced each other across the divide, separated by just a few meters. For 16 hours, American and Soviet tanks stood nose to nose at Checkpoint Charlie. One wrong move, one nervous soldier, one spark could have ignited military action that would rapidly escalate to nuclear confrontation. Kennedy and Khrushchev, realizing they stood at the precipice, agreed to de-escalate. Through diplomatic channels, they arranged a mutual withdrawal. Soviet and American tanks pulled back simultaneously. The crisis eased, but the Berlin Wall remained, standing as a concrete manifestation of the divided world. Stanislav Petrov, The Man Who Saved the World, 1983. Of all the moments when nuclear war nearly became reality, perhaps none was more terrifyingly close than September 26, 1983, and it hinged on one man's intuition. By 1983, Cold War tensions had deteriorated to their worst point in years. The Soviet Union's new leader, Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chairman, was convinced that the United States was preparing a surprise nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. He had authorized Operation Rayon, a massive intelligence operation designed to detect supposed American war preparations. The doomsday clock, maintained by atomic scientists, was set at 4 minutes to midnight. Nuclear war seemed imminent. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, a 44-year-old officer in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, took his seat for the night shift at Serpukhov 15, a top-secret command center 100 kilometers west of Moscow. His responsibility: monitor the OKO early warning satellite system that tracked potential American ICBM launches. If America attacked, Serpukhov 15 would provide crucial minutes for Soviet leadership to authorize a retaliatory strike. At 12:15 a.m., alarms erupted throughout the command center. The OKO satellite system had detected a launch, then another, then 3 more. The computer reported 5 American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles racing toward the Soviet Union. Protocol was clear. Petrov was supposed to immediately report the attack up the chain of command. Soviet military doctrine required immediate escalation. The Soviet General Staff would be notified. The rockets were already in flight, too fast to stop. Soviet commanders would have minutes to decide, launch a retaliatory strike against America, or die. Petrov had roughly 20 minutes to make the most consequential decision in human history. But something troubled him. He later explained his reasoning with devastating logic. When you see 5 missiles coming in, that's 5 missiles. When you see 200 missiles coming in, that's 200 missiles. I said, no. If they're going to attack, It's going to be a massive attack, not 5. If America truly intended to start a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, they would launch hundreds of missiles, not 5. 5 missiles were strategically meaningless. They would accomplish nothing against a nuclear power. Therefore, the alarm had to be false. Petrov's superiors demanded confirmation. He insisted the alarm was a false signal. He refused to report the attack. He sat in his chair, holding his nerves steady, resisting enormous pressure to activate the nuclear arsenal. Minutes stretched like hours. The alarm system continued screaming. Soviet officers stared at him, horrified that a single lieutenant colonel was preventing the nuclear response. But Petrov remained calm. 23 minutes passed. Then the teletype machines fell silent. No more alarms. No impact reports. No detonations across Soviet territory. Stanislav Petrov's intuition was correct. The satellites had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for attacking missiles. An investigation later confirmed the system malfunction. But at the time, Petrov had received no corroborating evidence. He had relied entirely on human judgment against the computer's warning. One man's reasoning had prevented nuclear war. Petrov received no medal. Instead, Soviet officials reprimanded him for inadequate documentation during the incident. The Soviet state kept the incident classified. Only after the Cold War ended did the story become public. By then, Petrov was already retired and largely forgotten. In 2006, the Association of World Citizens honored Petrov. In 2013, he received the Dresden Peace Prize. In 2014, a documentary titled The Man Who Saved the World told his story. Petrov died on May 19, 2017, at age 77. His death was announced only months later, after a family friend revealed it to the international media. How these crises were prevented. What common threads run through these near catastrophes? Why didn't nuclear war occur? The answers illuminate how humanity survived the most dangerous era in its history. First, political leadership mattered profoundly. Kennedy chose negotiation over military escalation during Cuba. Khrushchev prioritized nuclear deterrence over military victory and conquest. Both leaders, having witnessed World War II's devastation, understood war's true horrors intimately. Neither wanted nuclear annihilation despite facing pressure from hardliners. Second, accidental war was prevented by individual judgment and moral courage. Stanislav Petrov's decision to question the computer proved crucial. Had he robotically followed protocol and reported the false alarm, Soviet military commanders would have launched retaliatory missiles. One man's doubt and reasoning prevented civilization's end. His decision revealed the crucial importance of human judgment in nuclear weapons systems. Third, communication channels proved essential. The hotline established after Cuba enabled Kennedy and Khrushchev to communicate directly during crises. During Berlin's tank standoff, diplomatic channels allowed both sides to negotiate withdrawal without losing face. Fourth, both superpowers gradually recognized mutual vulnerability. The Cuban Missile Crisis taught a humbling lesson. In nuclear war, both sides lose catastrophically. There is no winning a nuclear war. There is no victory in mutual annihilation. This understanding eventually led to arms control agreements and nuclear strategy based on mutual deterrence rather than nuclear victory. Finally, sheer luck played an indispensable role. The Petrov incident could easily have ended differently. Robert McNamara acknowledged this, stating, "The actions of all three parties were shaped by misjudgment, miscalculations, and misinformation." Historian Walter Lefebvre went further, arguing that war was prevented by a combination of good fortune and cautious statesmanship. The lesson and legacy. The Cold War came closest to nuclear annihilation, not during major political crises alone, but during moments of technical failure, human error, and miscommunication, combined with political tension. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Crisis, and Stanislav Petrov's fateful night revealed a terrifying truth. Human civilization exists in a precarious balance, dependent entirely on clear thinking, direct communication, and the willingness of adversaries to prioritize survival over victory. Every crisis was prevented by someone saying no, refusing to escalate, refusing to panic, refusing to accept the computer's warning as final truth. In those critical moments, individual conscience, human judgment, and the desire for peace proved more powerful than weapons of mass destruction. The Berlin Wall has fallen, the Cold War has ended, the Soviet Union has dissolved, but its lessons remain vitally important. In a world still armed with thousands of nuclear weapons, and with new tensions emerging between world powers, the stories of how humanity pulled back from the brink remain profoundly relevant. We survived not because nuclear weapons kept us safe through their mere existence. We survived because political leaders, military officers, and intelligence analysts chose restraint. They chose communication. They chose dialogue. They chose life. We must remember these stories. We must honor those who prevented apocalypse. And we must never assume that in our own era, such wisdom will automatically prevail. History will remember the Cold War not as a period of nuclear war, but as a period when nuclear war was miraculously prevented. That miracle was no accident. It was the product of human courage, political restraint, and the enduring recognition that civilization's survival depends on our choices today.